You know, I always thought I had a pretty good handle on my family tree. At least I did until I tried explaining it to a friend from another country. And, well, let's just say that explaining second cousins once removed and great aunts who married in laws, well, it doesn't exactly translate well across cultures.
It's amazing how often those kinship structures, they've shaped societies for
Yes.
centuries.
Yeah, and for most of human history, it wasn't just about like awkward family reunions or anything.
Right.
These were the backbone of how society functioned, especially in societies without a strong centralized government.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's really interesting, and that's what's so intriguing about this anthropology text that we're diving into today. It focuses on kinship in those societies, where
Yeah.
family ties were how people organized themselves, how they managed resources, how they even kept the peace.
It's a very different perspective than we're used to.
Totally. It makes you re-examine a lot of assumptions that we have about family and power and social order that we kind of take for granted.
Absolutely.
Right. It's easy to forget that for most of human history, these intricate systems, that was it, that was the system.
Right.
But here's where this excerpt gets really interesting because it kind of throws us a curveball. It says, there are no societies based on kinship, nor has there ever been,
Yeah.
which seems to contradict, like, everything you're just talking about. So what's that about?
Well, that's Maurice Godelier, always a bit of a provocateur. But what he's getting at is that kinship, while it is a universal human experience, every society has some system of recognizing family. It's not this static determining force. It's a social construct. It's something that's molded and manipulated by cultures to serve their own needs and purposes, whether that's, inheritance rights, solidifying political alliances, or even managing conflict, as we're going to see.
So it's less about blood is thicker than water and more about strategically choosing whose blood you want to make thicker.
Yeah, precisely. And a great illustration of that is the Nuer. They're pastoralists in South Sudan. And they have this saying, they are our enemies, we marry them.
Whoa, okay,
Yeah.
to talk about burying the hatchet, they marry their enemies. That seems counterintuitive to say the least.
It's definitely counterintuitive from our modern perspective. But for the Nuer, marriage, it isn't just about romance. It's a powerful tool for building alliances and mitigating conflict. By marrying into rival groups, they create these webs of kinship ties that help maintain a balance of power and reduce the risk of all-out war.
It's like turning enemies into family,
Precisely.
literally weaving peace into the fabric of their society through marriage. Which, I mean, it really highlights how differently cultures define the purpose of marriage itself.
Absolutely. And the idea that romantic love should be the primary basis for marriage is actually a pretty recent development, and it's very culturally specific.
Yeah.
The excerpt actually mentions the Maasai, for example, who they see too much romantic love as a potential threat to a stable marriage.
Really. Too much love is a bad thing. You'd never see that on a Valentine's Day card.
Well, not unless it was a Maasai Valentine's Day card, I suppose.
Right.
But for them, as a pastoralist society, marriage, it's first and foremost an economic partnership. It's focused on raising children, managing their livestock.
Right.
And intense romantic love, it has that potential for jealousy, possessiveness. It can disrupt that delicate balance.
It disrupts the system.
Exactly.
And that makes sense if you think about the different priorities these societies have.
Yeah.
It's all about survival. It's about ensuring that the family line continues.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial aspect of kinship that the excerpt highlights, and that is the social and cultural factors that influence reproduction.
Okay.
Um,
And the excerpt doesn't mince words. They use that rather blunt phrase. Sperm is cheap, eggs are expensive.
it's a bit indelicate perhaps, but biologically accurate. The point being that this very basic biological difference, that men can father many children throughout their lives, while women have a limited number of eggs and pregnancies. This has had profound social and cultural repercussions.
Yeah, because it creates this power dynamic.
Right. And the excerpt really argues that this biological reality has led to attempts to control women's sexuality and their reproductive capacity.
Absolutely. Across cultures, we see this pattern of men, and often older men, seeking to regulate women's reproductive choices. And this manifests in a variety of ways, from very strict social norms to laws governing inheritance and even access to resources. It's fascinating and a little unsettling to see how this basic biological difference has played out in such complex social and cultural ways throughout history. And speaking of different cultural approaches, the excerpt also dives into the fascinating and sometimes controversial world of polygyny and polyandry.
Right. The one husband, multiple wives versus one wife, multiple husbands.
Exactly.
And what's interesting is just how statistically different those two practices are.
Right.
The excerpt cites the Ethnographic Atlas, which shows that polyandry is incredibly rare. It appears in only a handful of cultures throughout history. Polygyny, on the other hand, has been much more widespread.
It makes you wonder why that is. Is it purely cultural? Are there economic or environmental factors at play?
It's a complex interplay of factors. Take polyandry, for example. In societies where land is scarce, it might make sense for brothers to share a wife as a way to prevent the division of inheritance and keep their family's land holdings intact.
So instead of splitting up the family farm, you just share a wife. Talk about keeping it in the family.
In a sense, yes. It's a way of consolidating resources, but it's important to remember that these decisions are never just cold, hard calculations.
Right.
Cultural values, beliefs, they always play a role in shaping what's considered acceptable and even desirable.
Right. It's not just about practicality. It's also about these cultural norms and expectations. Speaking of cultural norms, the excerpt also delves into the world of marriage payments, specifically bride wealth and dowry.
Yes, two very different systems with potentially very different implications. Bride wealth, which is more common in parts of Africa, Asia, and indigenous cultures worldwide, involves the groom's family providing goods or services to the bride's family.
And it's not just about buying a wife, right?
Right, it's more nuanced than that. It's about recognizing the value a woman brings to a marriage, her labor, her ability to bear children, and compensating her family for that loss. It's about forging alliances between families and creating a system of mutual obligation and support.
So in a way, it elevates women, not as property, but as valuable members of society.
You could see it that way.
It's fascinating how these systems reflect different cultural values and priorities.
Absolutely, and it's important to remember that these practices aren't static. They evolve over time, influenced by everything from economic changes to shifting power dynamics between men and women.
Dowry, though, as the excerpt explains, has also been associated with some, well, negative practices.
Yes, unfortunately.
It's a good reminder that even these systems that are designed to create stability and order can sometimes have unintended consequences.
Right, they're human creations after all, and they're shaped by cultural values and power dynamics that aren't always equitable. But these marriage payments, both bride wealth and dowry, they're really just one piece of a much larger puzzle. They're often part of this broader system of alliances and obligations that extend far beyond the immediate families that are involved.
It's like these marriages, they're creating this ripple effect of alliances throughout the entire society.
Exactly. And those alliances, they could be incredibly complex. The excerpt talks about moieties and asymmetrical alliances, these systems that dictate marriage patterns between different groups within a society.
Okay, so it's not just about two people getting married. It's about forging these connections between entire kinship groups.
Precisely, and these alliances, they serve these crucial social functions, especially in societies that didn't have strong centralized governments. I mean, they helped prevent incest, of course, but they also created bonds of reciprocity and obligation. And those bonds were really essential for maintaining peace, facilitating trade, and even defending against outside threats.
It's like a complex web of strategic alliances with each marriage strengthening those bonds and ensuring the survival of the group. It's really amazing how these systems evolve to meet those really fundamental human needs.
Yeah, and that complexity is actually reflected in one of the big debates within anthropology. Descent theory versus alliance theory.
Right. So descent theory, that's all about shared bloodlines, those ancestral connections. It's the we're family because we share the same great-great-grandparents argument.
Exactly. And then alliance theory kind of flips the script. It emphasizes the bonds that get created through marriage, especially that exchange of women between groups. So their argument is that it's these alliances, not just shared ancestry, that are the real glue that holds societies together.
So it's less about where you come from and more about who you're connected to through these webs of marriage alliances.
Yeah, you could put it that way. And this debate played out in some really fascinating ways as anthropologists studied different cultures.
Yeah.
You know, in patrilineal societies
Yeah.
where lineage is traced through the father's line, the focus was on how those kinship groups function. But then in societies where marriage alliances were really paramount, the emphasis shifted to understanding these complex webs of relationships.
So the anthropologists' understanding of kinship was shaped by the specific cultures that they were studying.
Exactly.
Which makes sense, but it wasn't about one theory being right and the other being wrong.
Right.
It seems like both descent and alliance, they're both essential to understanding the full picture of kinship.
Absolutely. Both perspectives offer valuable insights into how societies actually function. And just as our understanding of kinship has evolved over time, well, so too has our understanding of family itself,
Hmm.
especially now with the rise of genetic testing.
It's true. It feels like everyone and their mother has a DNA test kit these days, eager to uncover their ancestral roots and, maybe connect with some long-lost relatives. It's definitely shaken up our understanding of family trees, that's for sure.
It certainly has. But anthropologists are less interested in that raw genetic data itself, and much more interested in how people interpret that data. How does it challenge or reinforce existing ideas about family and race and identity? It's fascinating to see how different cultures are incorporating this new genetic knowledge into their own worldviews.
So it's not about the genes themselves, it's about the meaning and the weight that those different cultures give to those genes.
Precisely. The book Race, Ethnicity, and Nation, which is mentioned in the excerpt actually, it explores this in depth. It highlights how, people in different cultural contexts might emphasize biological ancestry, whereas others prioritize social ties and shared experiences as more meaningful markers of kinship.
It's like those kinship systems that we were talking about earlier, where your mother's brother, they might not be your biological uncle, but they're a really close family friend who kind of plays that same social role.
Exactly, and it highlights how fluid kinship is. It's constantly being negotiated
Hmm.
and redefined based on cultural values, social norms, individual experiences. Which brings us to a concept that the excerpt touches on that feels very relevant today, metaphoric kinship.
Metaphoric kinship. Okay, what is that?
Well, it's this idea that kinship, that sense of belonging, of shared identity, it can extend beyond our immediate families, even beyond traditional blood ties. It's about how we use kinship as a metaphor to understand our place in these larger social groups and even entire nations.
So things like national identity, religious communities, even like those really diehard sports fan groups, those can all be forms of metaphoric kinship.
Absolutely. Just think about the language we use. Motherland, brothers in arms, a band of brothers.
Right.
These terms evoke that same sense of loyalty, obligation, and shared identity that we very naturally associate with family, even if those bonds aren't based on blood ties.
It's like we're hardwired for that sense of belonging, for that need to be a part of something that's larger than ourselves.
Yeah.
And we see it everywhere, from those ancient marriage alliances that we were talking about to like modern day fan communities. It's powerful stuff. It really makes you think about the role of kinship in a world that, it often feels increasingly individualistic. And sure, we've explored how it shapes societies for centuries, but what about today with, globalized economies, massive bureaucratic systems? Does kinship still hold the same power?
It's a great question, and the excerpt actually addresses this very point.
Hmm.
While many of kinship's traditional functions, like managing resources or organizing those political alliances, those have been taken over by institutions.
Mm-hmm.
But those fundamental principles of kinship, those haven't disappeared. They've just adapted to these new social realities.
So it's not like we're relying on our second cousins to like settle legal disputes or negotiate trade agreements anymore.
Not usually, no. But the excerpt highlights a really interesting tension that exists in the modern world. Kinship-based organization versus bureaucratic organization.
Okay, so kinship-based organization, that's about those personal connections, the obligations that we feel to family and close friends. It's about loyalty, reciprocity, looking out for your own.
Exactly. And bureaucratic organization is almost the antithesis of that. It's about rules, procedures, these impersonal transactions. It's about trying to create a level playing field, at least in theory, where everyone is treated equally, regardless of their personal connections.
It's not personal, it's just business mentality.
Exactly. And as you can imagine, these two systems, they often collide. The excerpt uses the example of nepotism, right? Like favoring family members in hiring or promotions. From a bureaucratic perspective, it's seen as unfair, a violation of those meritocratic ideals.
Yeah.
But from a kinship perspective, it can be seen as this expression of loyalty, a way of ensuring the well-being of your own.
So it's like we're constantly trying to balance those two competing impulses, that desire to look out for your own flesh and blood and the need to uphold these broader social ideals of fairness and impartiality.
Exactly. And that tension plays out in all sorts of interesting ways in the modern world, from the way we structure our social safety nets to how we think about things like inheritance and legacy.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that even in this world that's, dominated by technology and globalization, these really, really ancient bonds of kinship, they still have this powerful influence on our lives.
Absolutely. And it's something that anthropologists continue to study and debate, how kinship is evolving, how it intersects with other social forces, and what it reveals about that enduring power of human connection.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of kinship. I feel like it's taken us from like ancient marriage alliances to modern day DNA tests, from the plains of Africa to the halls of academia.
It really has.
And I think what we've learned is that kinship, well, it's anything but simple. It's messy, it's complicated, and it's constantly evolving. But one thing's for sure, it's a fundamental part of what makes us human.
Beautifully said. And I hope that the next time we encounter, maybe a complicated family tree or wrestle with the ethics of nepotism, we'll all remember that we're actually engaging with one of the most enduring and multifaceted aspects of human experience.
We hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for just how powerful and complex kinship can be, and that it sparked your curiosity to learn even more. So until next time, keep exploring those ideas, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep those family ties strong in whatever form they take.